Hey, Stacey David here, and this is the Tales of a Gearhead podcast. This podcast is brought to you by Cornwell Tools, the choice of professionals since 1919. That's right, over 100 years building tools and still going strong. If you need tools, check them out. You won't be disappointed. All right, let's get rolling.
Let's rewind just a hair, because you mentioned something that to you, it came out like super quick, but to someone like me, I'm just like, wait a minute, did you just say Grand Ole Opry? I mean, the Grand Ole Opry is one of the most famous radio broadcast shows that's ever been.
Oh, yeah, it's a great place. What Opryland would do at the time is that they would pick out certain performers that they thought were good enough, or I don't even know the proper way to say this, but they were very selective. There was only like 5 that they would pick a year. They would say, you know, you've been selected to be on a guest appearance on the Grand Ole Opry. And the first time I was on with Roy Acuff, you know, the legend himself. And so it was a big deal. It was a big deal. I mean, especially to like my parents. My dad grew up listening to the Opry. So he was like beside himself. He says, I can't believe you're on the stage with Roy Acuff. See, the thing is, working at Opryland, you were around all of these people, you know, and I was backstage at the Opry all the time because I knew the people there. So they were like, okay, we want you to be on the Opry. And my musical style is very similar to my car building style. It's kind of unpredictable. And it's a lot more rock and roll and blues than country. I'm probably the only person that ever did the moonwalk on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry. And I managed to fit it into the song. And it was a lot of fun, you know. And of course, the audience loved it. But Roy was looking at me like, what in the world are you doing, kid? It was a fun deal. It was an honor. I mean, it was an honor to be selected. My daily driver at the time was a 64 Corvette. Yeah, it's not the typical daily driver for somebody, you know, in their 20s or whatever. But what would happen is that I didn't even have to have a special pass on the car. They'd see the car coming in. They're like, oh, yeah, that's that dude in that vet. He obviously has a pass, because who else would drive a car like that? So it got me in a lot of places. And, you know, got me into a lot of music videos and that kind of stuff, too, with some of the cars that I had. But, yeah, it was a real fun deal. You know, I met Johnny Cash's daughter, Cindy Cash. She was a photographer out there at the time doing some stuff, and that in turn led to me, you know, hanging out with Johnny some. You know, that was the cool thing about Nashville. There's so many people around here, you never know who you're talking to. You know, I worked part-time at a pawn shop downtown between seasons at Opryland, and I remember the first time that I was working in there, I kind of hung around the musical instruments, and I would, you know, do the appraisals on those. And this black guy walks in. He's in a blue suit, you know, real professional-looking guy. He's walking around. Had this great laugh, you know, just this great congenial guy. And one of the guys looks at me and goes, you know who that is? And I was like, no. I have no idea who it is. He says, well, that's Billy Cox. He played bass for Jimi Hendrix. And I'm like, Billy Cox, really? And Billy and I became great friends. You've seen him on the show. When I did the Rat Roaster thing, I brought Billy in. And Billy is just one of those guys. He is, to me, what personifies a true Nashville musician. Guy who worked in it for years. He's a survivor. Still has a great attitude. My gosh, what a story he's got. It was really fun. So those are the kind of things that were great. I had one gig come up one time. You know, you take anything for money, and they had me do this Elvis gig where I was supposed to walk around, you know, dressed like Elvis. And, you know, I had the roadkill wig on and the suit and all. And the suit was for somebody that was like 3 times my size. And it was all open in the front, so you could literally look right down and see to my shoes unless you put the sash on, you know. And I'm like, this is paying me how much? I think it was like $100. So I get out there. And I mean, this thing is, you can see my package, everything. It was terrible. And it was all like 60-year-old women. So I come walking up and, man, they're looking at me and they're like, so you supposed to go home with me or what? And it was the most embarrassing thing. It's the only gig that I literally walked off of. I went out there and I was like, I can't do this. Oh my gosh. My wife was doing it too. She was roller skating like a Bobby Soxer, and she still laughs so hard at that. Oh my gosh. So yeah, you do things when you're young and stupid. Kind of like some of the street racing things we did. The first paint job that I did was in Dad's garage on a dune buggy, and I was going to paint it purple. And because that's what you did with the dune buggies, you painted it purple. And so I got this metallic paint, and at the time there were two types of paint. There was lacquer and there was acrylic enamel. I remember 20 coats of lacquer. You know, guys talking, so I'm like, oh man, I got to have lacquer. And every time I would talk to somebody like at the paint store, they're like, oh yeah, lacquer, man, it's awesome. Fortunately, it was the right choice for me. So I went in and I painted this in Dad's garage, covered everything with overspray. You know, everything has a purple hue in the garage. Fortunately, if you guys know, lacquer dust is very, very thin, and lacquer dries very quickly, so it was mostly dust. Unlike your enamels and stuff where when it hits, it's still wet, and you have to use thinner to get it off. So that is the only reason I'm still alive. You know, I was able to get that lacquer dust off of Dad's cars and stuff, but I didn't know anything about, you know, covering things, you know, taping things off properly. You know, you just learned by doing it. That's where that kind of started. And then, you know, I kept moving through that. And finally, you know, I got it down to where, you know, I was a really good painter. I had really good gun control, and I was always talking to other painters. You know, at the time, I remember doing my first acrylic enamel paint job. I hated that stuff because it didn't have hardener at the time. And the enamels always kind of stayed kind of wet. So they were really hard to buff, to cut and buff, whereas lacquer, you could do that. So when the urethanes came out, oh, that was awesome. And a lot of the cars that I did, I would paint them in the driveway or paint them in a barn or a garage. And you had to figure that there were some bugs that were going to get in it. That's why cutting and buffing were so important, because you had to be able to get that stuff out. But the very first car that I did that was in a magazine and that I won a bunch of major awards with was a 67 Mustang Convertible that I had done a bunch of Shelby stuff to, which nobody was really doing at the time. So it looked like a 67 Shelby Convertible. And I figured that I was safe doing that since there were no 67 Shelby Convertibles built. You know, there were still people like, so is it a real one or is it a fake? And that's why I'm so adamant now about telling people, listen, don't do a replica, don't do a clone, because you never want to spend the time on something that you have built and put your heart and soul in. You don't want to have to spend the time trying to explain to people why it's a fake. I mean, or why it's a replica. I mean, those are bad words. You don't want to be called a fake on anything, so don't go there. You know, don't put SS stripes and SS badging on a Chevelle that's not an SS. Unless you want to just spend the time going, well, you know, it's not really an SS. There's better ways to do it. But anyway, so as far as painting like that, this Mustang, I actually painted it in an open barn, you know, shot it out there. And I remember I had this paint laying down, man. It was laying down. And it was coming out of the gun, and I mean, the music was playing, and it was great, and I actually had a real respirator on, and everything's great, and I get the final coat on, I'm looking at the car, and it's just shining, it's like singing to me, man. And I turn around, and I look again, and there's a big fly right on the middle of the hood. A fly, buried in the paint, looking up at me. And it's like, oh... You know, so then you're in that thing. It's like, okay, do I go after the fly and potentially put a whole battle scene on the hood, or do I wait, let it harden, go in there, chip the fly away, and fix the issue? Both are ways you can go. Well, I decided to go after the fly, had my little tweezers, and I managed to get him out of there and get it fixed. But man, I was like, really? So it's just when I tell people to be prepared, just be prepared for things to happen and know how to fix them and realize, man, you can fix anything. You can fix anything. So the fly in the paint job. You know, I talked to a guy the other day, and it wasn't too long before we started talking tools. That always comes up. And he said the stuff on the trucks are just too darn expensive, man. It's just for rich people. And I laughed and I asked him how valuable his time was. And he said he didn't understand the question. And I explained that the more time he spends messing around with cheap, crappy tools, the more time you waste getting nothing done. And time is a commodity we all have in limited supply. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, maybe I'll look into some of those tools on a truck. He won't be disappointed, neither will you. Check him out. All right, we got a muscle car question here. This is a very, very common question. This is coming from Richard. Richard says, I got a 73 Cuda. Well, first of all, Richard, awesome, man. I looked at one of those the other day. It was rusted into nothing, man. I had to pass on it. I've always wanted one of those cars. I have never owned a Cuda, the 70 through the 74. So I'm still looking for that. So congratulations on having one. Now, his question is, would installing an aftermarket wiring harness be better than repairing the original? Yes. Yes. I know why you're asking that. A lot of people ask this question because they don't want to do wiring. If you haven't done it before, most people are scared to death of it. And it's a pain. You got to pull the dash apart. You got to get up, you start pulling things apart and it's messy and it's a real gray area for most people. And I get that. Having done many, many, many wiring harnesses, I can assure you, you can do this. It's not that hard a deal. You just got to go a step at a time. Get yourself a good harness. There's a lot of great companies out there. There's Painless, there's Ron Francis, there's American Auto Wire. There's a lot of people, and they all have good products. So get one, that all the wires are marked and jump into it. And, there's a lot of guys that come in that have a car that's in really good shape. Now, Richard doesn't tell us how good his car is. I mean, it could be a 20,000 original mile car. Still needs a harness. Because keep in mind, that harness is almost 50 years old. And harnesses were not made to last that long. The connections get cruddy. The wires crack. Mice get up in there. There's all kinds of things that can happen. There's just been so many improvements just in wiring itself over the years, and the connections and stuff. It's just better to do it that way. Give you a great peace of mind. And like I said, if you get in there, lay out the project and jump into it, man, you'll be able to do this. One of the things that I will tell you, though, and unfortunately, none of the wiring companies tell you this because that's not really their job. They just assume you know what you're doing, so they'll just give you instructions on how to actually put the harness in. What they don't tell you is the prep that goes into putting a wiring harness in a vehicle. So let me just kind of walk you through that a little bit. The biggest thing will be the interior. Most vehicles, pickups, cars, trucks of any era, they have the fuse block under the dash or down on one of the sides or, kind of in that area. And then you have all your main wiring that runs under the dash. Now, this is wiring for your gauges. This is for your air conditioning units, your temperature control. And then the wiring harnesses go out into the doors for any kind of power windows, door locks, and it just spiders out. So what you'll need to do is pull that dash apart to be able to get to the wiring harness. That will mean the gauges will have to come out and the glove box, and you might have to drop some of the heater ducts. That's where your prep will come in to figuring out just how time, labor intensive this is going to be. Got 73 Cuda, not too bad. Most of this thing will come apart fairly easily. But you might have to take the whole heater out and get behind it. That's the prep you'll have to do. Laying the new harness in is not hard. And then most of your wire runs down the driver's side to the back. There's a whole harness that goes into the trunk. That's unplugging all of your taillights and all of your gas gauge and everything that's in the back of the car. And then there's also a harness that will go through the firewall. Usually there's a plug. And then it branches out into your front headlights and all of your electrical up there, as well as your engine controls. That's basically how it's laid out. You'll just have to look at your vehicle and see how labor intensive it is. I know for a fact that you kind of looked out on that Cuda. A lot of that wiring is there exposed on the firewall. You can follow it around. Some of the other cars, like Corvettes and stuff where they kind of hid the wiring, it can be a little more of a challenge. So spend your time getting ready to prep it out, and you'll be able to knock it out, and you'll be thinking, gosh, I used to think this was so hard. And you'll be able to do it. Good luck to you, man. Okay, this question comes from Haley. This is on a quick tip that I did on hooking up 2 batteries. He asks, so you can connect 2 batteries directly without the need of solenoids or fuses like everybody else suggests. No, the quick tip was just how 2 batteries are hooked together. Now, you can hook them together like that and everything would be fine. The problem is, and this is where solenoids and fuses come in, fuses are for safety, solenoids are for control. And anytime you hook 2 batteries together, those 2 batteries will kind of work against each other. In other words, if they're not 100% equal, then the one that has a little less will pull from the one battery, and they'll kind of stair-step each other like that and slowly discharge. So what you want to do, I believe the kit that I had on there was one from Painless. They make a really good kit for running 2 batteries together. And it has the fuses, and it has the solenoid, so you can run on one battery and have the other battery in reserve. And you can flip the switch, and your alternator will charge both batteries at the same time, or just one. Or you can flip it and have both batteries working at the same time. That way you can keep them charged, and you can control them. And that's how your vehicles come from the factory if they are a dual battery vehicle. You know, there is some controls and some things between them. But if you just want to hook 2 batteries together, yeah, you can hook them together. Just remember, you need to know the difference between hooking them up parallel and hooking them up in series. That is a big thing. Hooking them up in series means they are connecting just like you put them into a flashlight. So it's positive to negative and so on, which gives you not 12 volts, but 24 volts. And 24 volts is a lot. You can weld with that. So you don't want to hook them up wrong for your vehicle. You'll burn everything up. Parallel, just think 2 batteries side by side. Positive to positive, negative to negative. You still have 12 volts of power, just double the capacity. And that's how vehicles are set up. This is one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they start messing with military stuff. Most military is 24 volt. And guys will get in there and they go, hey, what are these 2 batteries? And they'll assume that they're hooked up, in parallel. And man, if you happen to ground a wrench against the frame, buddy, I'll tell you what, it will set you back. I have experienced that. Yeah, you got to be really careful when you start connecting batteries in series. So anyway, hopefully this helps. It's a really wise thing, especially have an off-road vehicle or a Jeep or something. I always suggest doing a 2 battery setup. I strongly suggest using one of the kits from like Painless or one of the other wiring companies or something that allows you to hook them up with the proper fuses and solenoids so you can control them. All right, hope that helps you, Haley. All right, this question comes from Scott, and he says, can you put 3/4 ton axles into a 1/2 ton 4-wheel drive Chevy Silverado? Yes. Yes, you can, and yes, you should. Now, Scott, you're not asking or telling me what you've got here, so please don't think those are just going to bolt in, because chances are you may have to change the spring perches if you're staying with leaf springs. But yeah, you can put anything into anything pretty much, depending on your fabrication skills and stuff. Keep in mind, if you're bumping up to 3/4 ton axles, you're probably going to have a different bolt pattern, so wheels and tires are going to have to be upgraded. But yeah, that's a very common swap that we've been doing for a long time. And it's a great way to get some strength into a 1/2 ton truck. I would recommend it. If you stick with a Chevrolet, a lot of times the spring pads will even be in the right place. Don't be surprised if you got to move them a little bit. I would suggest, if you are finding you've got a Chevy Silverado, I'd find a 3/4 ton Chevy Silverado and do the swap. You'll probably want the transfer case. I don't know what kind of how extensive this project is, but if you're talking about swapping axles, it's probably pretty extensive. So yeah, do it. I strongly suggest it. All right, that wraps it up for us today. Make sure that you check out the Gears TV website. We got all kinds of cool stuff there. We got a couple new die casts coming out. Got some books coming out. We have all kinds of things going on. But the most important thing is get out there and turn some wrenches yourself. Get a project. If you don't have one, start working on it. And if you don't have tools, check out Cornwell. They can help you out there.